Yurkovich come up from media to discuss our Delaware County sustainability plan, which was finalized in 2022, 2023. So as you'll see, this is a far-reaching plan for how to properly manage the progress of our county, much like our comprehensive plan in our township does the same. So Rebecca, please.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to see all of you today. So we're going to power through, but if there are questions while we're going, feel free. Otherwise, I'll try to leave a lot of time at the end so we can go down some tangents. I know I could have talked your ear off for hours about your agenda items. So I'm very excited to be here today. So as noted, I'm from the Delaware County Office of Sustainability. I'm the county's sustainability officer. So thank you. I am part of your tax dollars at work. So some of the things we're going to talk about today is first, why is climate change something we're talking about at a county level? Next, we're going to share what the county is doing, so our plan. And then we'll wrap up with some actions for everyone here. So starting at the basics, sustainability is a term that we're hearing a lot in the news and in our county and in our township. But when you're asked to describe it, it's not always intuitive. So to start off, just as kind of a kickoff, when I'm talking about sustainability, it's this big idea here. So creating and maintaining conditions under which humans and nature can exist in productive harmony to support both our present and future generations. So pretty basic. But then with some of the critics, you get the question why? And the fast response is because climate change. Well, once again, why is that such a big deal? At the most basic level, our climate change is long-term shifts in weather and temperature. Doesn't seem very controversial. But the second piece is where it starts to get some folks, is why it's happening. And in the terms, or in the trends rather, we've seen since the 1800s, human activities are making this happen faster than it has in history. And that's where it gets a little controversial. On a county level, what you see on the screen here is our average daily temperatures in Delaware County from the 1890s all the way through 2022. And while you can see there's a lot of variability year to year, overall it is trending upward. So this goes to show it's not just something we see kind of on a global level, it is something we're seeing impacts of here at home as well. I think kind of more viscerally, we're also seeing harsher storms that are happening more frequently as well. And I always like to note that all the photos you're going to see in the presentation today are from Delaware County towns. And if you note here in the photos, these aren't just one town. It's not just our riverfront. It's not just one creek that's having problems. It's widespread across our county. We're seeing these storms get harsher and worse flood conditions. Shout out to Radnor for being the top right. So I think one thing that is important to consider, not only why the county is doing this, it's for health, safety, and welfare, but as you're looking at this as a topic yourself, also considering what is your why? Why is this something that's important to you? What do you want to see move forward and change as we look toward the future? So now that we've doom and gloomed, let's swing upward to see what is the county doing about this. So as noted, this plan was adopted in August of 2023, but it took 2.5, 3 years to get to that point. And I always like to kind of bring up this slide to kick off to recognize, even at the county level, when doing this plan, we had to consider, well, what can a county actually do? So where does the county have control to take sustainability action? And this is always a really important first step because I know a lot of the times in this sustainability space, you see people getting frustrated and kind of spinning their wheels of, I'm not making progress. And sometimes that's because we're not trying to impact things we can actually control. So as our first step, we looked at county. What can we control? So that's our county facilities and buildings. We have 17 parks. We have over 80 bridges, over 3,000 employees, property taxes, over 300 vehicles, as well as kind of our administrative policies. Next, we had to consider where the county doesn't have control. Where do we have influence to make change in this space? So we looked at where are those organizations or who are those partners that we have a seat at their table. So a lot of this is with our municipalities, looking at folks we fund. So SEPTA, we're at their table. The Delaware County Transportation Management Association, the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission, and some of the other organizations you see. And then we had to consider what can we do in that space where we don't have immediate control for change and we don't necessarily have an intimate seat at the table. And we found that our real role in that space is then education. So that's probably our biggest point of impact for kind of residents, businesses, industries, because we can't really control the outcome of change. So once we considered kind of what our role is in this space, we then had to consider, okay, well, what are we trying to tackle? So the first thing we looked at is we really set 4 key values that we wanted to see throughout this entire planning process. And those are the 4 boxes you see on the outside of the screen here. So no matter what we were doing, we wanted to make sure that these values permeated throughout. So first and foremost, economic sustainability, making sure we're not burdening our taxpayers with our implementation strategies. Next, looking at education, governance, and finally, equity, inclusion, and justice. Throughout this plan, we set kind of a structure throughout because we didn't want to see this just be a document that sits on a shelf. We wanted it to be something that's truly implemented. So within each focus area, we set a primary goal, which is kind of the aspiration into the far future. We also set sub-goals that are more specific, as well as measurable targets, and over 250 actions. And I know a lot of the time when I say that number, folks are like, 250, good luck with that. But I can tell you it was deliberate. As somebody that is a planner at heart, I was sick of reading government plans where they're super, super vague actions. You never really know, are we done? Are we not done? Can we cross it off? So these actions build on each other, and they're meant to be incredibly specific. As a checklist kind of gal, that's the speed we went with. And then the other portion of the plan I always like to highlight is these sustainability spotlights. We wanted this plan to not only be a space of kind of setting the pace for the future, but also sharing the inspiring stories that are already happening in Delaware County. So each section of the plan shows something great the county is doing, as well as a local community. In terms of action, again, wanted to make sure this was a plan that we can actually use. So for each action, and this is the zero waste section just as a teaser, we chose to set a lead organization that's within the county. We also set partners, so who are those people that should be at the table when things are getting done? A rough time frame, and finally this idea of applicability. And this is something I always like to point out of in doing presentations or sharing this plan, folks are like, this is great, what can we do to help? And it's not always an easy question to answer. So what this column is it essentially says that although the action is for Delaware County, Here are all the other organizations that could do the exact same thing within their own level of control. So for example, if you look at the create a policy for digitizing county records, that's something a municipality could do. That's something an educational institution or a nonprofit or a business. Those are all things that those groups could also do. So this kind of allows it to be a checklist for other organizations to also go through and have their own ideas. So let's get into what's in this plan. Our first focus area was looking at climate resilience, recognizing that if we are having climate change and are having harsher storms, first and foremost, we need to make sure our residents can deal with the storm. So this looks at our climate response to the hazards. It also looks at economy, making sure that if our residents have a stronger financial footing on blue sky days, they will automatically be in a better place when the storms are hitting. And also making sure our infrastructure is built in a way that we can withstand harsher storms. Again, always like to point out, all the photos are Delaware County. There was a brush fire in Chadds Ford a couple years back, if you were curious about the fire. Because we're over a year out, I also like to highlight some of the things that the county has done to move this forward. And one thing of note too is in highlighting this progress, it's important to note not all of these things were done by the county. That seems a little weird, but if we want to see this truly move forward and have Delaware County be more sustainable moving forward, it's not something the county can do alone. So in asking municipalities or individuals or other groups to take action, it's also important to recognize their successes, which support the ideas of this plan. So a couple things of note. I guess some to highlight, I'm not going to go through all of these, but our planning department recently got BRIC funding, so Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, to help tackle some of the flooding issues in Darby Creek across from Eastwick. Another, in our economy section, Media Borough started a sustainable storefront program that's highlighting businesses that are going above and beyond for sustainability. And another, the Brandywine Conservancy down in the Chadds Ford area, they recently did a watershed-wide flood study that was pretty impactful in that it didn't just cross counties, it also crossed into the state of Delaware, which it's not kind of groundbreaking that you do a study with all the cities in a watershed, but that was the first time that both Pennsylvania and Delaware had done this kind of study in that area. So moving on from climate, we then looked at natural resources. So the kind of tree hugging sustainability a lot of us know and love. So this included looking at our open spaces, our tree canopy and native plantings, watershed quality, and brownfields. Brownfields are areas that are either contaminated or considered contaminated because of their previous uses. And one thing I always like to point out in this space to kind of level set of where we are is over 97% of creeks in Delaware County are currently considered impaired under the PADEP. So what that means is they're not meeting state water quality standards to say it's a healthy and thriving creek. So it's always important to kind of note where we are to know why we're moving in this direction. And if we have time at the end, I linked the map so we can look at how Radnor is doing. So some of the exciting things underway in this space. The Office of Sustainability is currently undertaking a tree canopy study. So this looks at historic imagery over the decades to look at degradation of tree canopy, and then also takes a deeper dive of why certain areas are having tree loss. Maybe it's a golf course, I'm not sure. So that should be coming out this May. Other things, Rose Tree Park just did a 1 acre meadow conversion. So Hopefully coming back in a year or two, it'll be wildflowers rather than mowing over a full acre of that park. Other things of note, in the top right, that's a watershed map of the county. Currently, we have watershed groups covering all watersheds except the Namens, Marcus Hook, and Stony Creeks, which are down in the Marcus Hook, Trainer, Chester area. And the Clean Air Council is currently working to start a watershed group down there. So then all of our water bodies would have advocacy groups for them. From natural resources, we then looked at transportation, recognizing that over 70% of trips in Delaware County are one person in one car. And the average commute is over 37 minutes of that one person in one car. This is troubling because according to SEPTA, we have the best suburban transit access of all the collar counties. So that's kind of a rough number since we do have pretty good access. So in this space, we looked at how can we get folks out of cars, whether that's through walking, biking, or transit. But then it also takes it a step forward to recognize not everywhere is a media, not everywhere is a Lansdowne, and it doesn't make sense for everywhere to be. So it doesn't make sense for all of our communities to have sidewalks. For perspective, having Chadds Ford or maybe Radnor in certain areas where houses are 1.5 acres apart, that might not make sense. So that also opens up space for integration of electric vehicles as well. So some of the things going on in this space, always got to highlight our planning department as well. They're currently wrapping up active transportation plans as well as Vision Zero plans for the county. A Vision Zero is recognizing that kind of minimizing traffic and pedestrian accidents down to zero. The county also supported the SEPTA Key Advantage program for all of its employees, which allowed us to have free transit passes for the past, I think, 9 months to try to encourage folks to get out of their cars for commuting. And another, if you haven't been to media recently, we did just install 6 additional chargers for the county fleet at the Orange Street parking lot. And if any of you guys would like to see the electric vehicles we have at the county, I did bring one today. Next, we looked at energy and efficiencies, and this is pretty straightforward. How can we use less water, and how can we use less electricity? And as Dan noted earlier, it's also how can we switch to renewables where possible for our energy usage. In terms of photos, both of these photos are actually on the courthouse roof. We have over 1,000 solar panels currently in that location. So in addition to our current solar, some of the things we're working on, we did receive a $400,000 grant to switch all the lights to LED. It's currently on pause, but hopefully that will come back around in the coming weeks. We've also joined SEPSPA, which is the Southeastern Pennsylvania Sustainable Energy Partnership. This is something where we're actually purchasing all of our electricity in partnership with Chester County, Montgomery County, and Bucks. And we're purchasing renewable energy credits, but also looking at where we can invest in regional solar projects as well. This is of note too, because we're currently talking about how we may be able to onboard municipalities into these purchasing agreements as well. I also always like to point out, gotta humble ourselves. One of the things that we recently did is implemented off-hours energy reduction. While that sounds very fancy, it's turning the lights off when people aren't in the building. I know that sounds ridiculous, but as of 2 years ago, the lights in the courthouse never went off. Doesn't matter if it was a Saturday, doesn't matter if it was a Monday at 2 a.m., the lights never went off. So that's something that we've recently worked to reinvigorate, is having lighting schedules. So I always like to bring that up to not only show that small steps are still steps, But it doesn't always have to be like an ostentatious project to make sustainable change. And shout out to Radnor, y'all are also on here for participating in the regional benchmarking project. So next, we looked at zero waste, which is pretty straightforward. How can we reduce what's going into our waste stream, both at a county level and a operational level? Some of the fun projects to highlight here is we do campaign sign recycling each year. This past November, we recycled over 7,000 pounds of metal and plastic just from campaign signs. So it's pretty significant when you consider how light those materials are. Also happy to share, if you haven't been in the government center, there's a like a catering company that runs a cafeteria for our building. We had them switch over to composting in 2024, only for back of house. So not any of the customers, just the kitchen during prep. And they composted over 15,000 pounds last year alone. And that's just one business. And then another project to highlight, Dan had mentioned it earlier. We did apply for over $4 million to try to create a countywide composting facility, household hazardous waste drop-off, and a recycling hub. That's still pending, but we're very hopeful. And then that brings us to the last section of our plan, which is health and wellness. And this section really highlights why it's important to look at kind of what we control versus influence versus educate. So for example, county level, we don't control air quality permits. We don't control water quality permits. We don't have a whole lot of control in this space, but that doesn't mean there aren't things that we can do. Again, always highlighting the kind of depressing facts. Delaware County is rated a D for air quality by the American Lung Association. That's something I always like to bring up as well, because a lot of the time I think there's this mindset of, oh, that's a Chester City issue, or oh, that's a Trainer or Marcus Hook. Our whole county received that rating, and additionally, our whole region is in a non-attainment status with the EPA, meaning we're not meeting federal air quality standards for our region. So it's something, again, all of us as residents need to consider and be aware of and consider what we can do in this space as well. So a little less space, again, not as much that we control, but some of the things we're doing are mapping food insecurity across the county. Also installing over 50 air quality monitors in our riverfront region so we can better identify and pinpoint pollution events. And our Parks Department's also looking to install additional community garden plots in Little Flower Manor. So now that we kind of know what the county's plan is, I would highly encourage all of you as we move forward to consider kind of what you can control, where you have influence, and where you can educate both in your own lives or as an EAC or as any part of a group that you are involved with. And as I always like to give people homework, I pulled lots of different examples of things that the Radnor EAC or this community could potentially install. And I will say, looking at your website, you guys are doing lots of great things, so you should be very proud. But some fun things to consider. So maybe something like adopting a drain program. So that's very much like adopting a rain garden, but it's essentially, hey, you're in charge of making sure this drain is not blocked during storm events. Something else where you can have influence, talking to your elected officials about joining the community rating system. This is a program that essentially, if the township goes above and beyond flood regulations, so things like having a floodplain ordinance or providing education about keeping drains clear, it gives residents who are in the National Flood Insurance Program significant discounts on their bills. And then another in terms of education, something we can do as individuals. Share the good, bad, and the ugly of your own personal sustainability journey. Not everything works for everybody. And I think we need to encourage our neighbors that, hey, you know what, sometimes it doesn't work out for us, but you got to continue and find what works for you in your own life. For energy, waste, and health, it's also doing things like looking at your monthly usage and consider swapping to renewables, like Dan mentioned earlier. You could also do things like composting in your community. And if that's not possible, look at the other alternatives. The photo you see here is something being deployed in Lower Marion Township, where rather than having like a compost site, they essentially offer memberships to their residents where they can buy in to drop all their compost off at these bins, and it gets composted through a company. It's very low cost. Other things in terms of influence, kind of know the facts, know what the local air quality is. And if you're displeased, write your state reps, because they're the ones that are overseeing our air quality permits. And then finally, share what you learn. I think it's important that we're having these community conversations moving forward. So some key takeaways for today. First, kind of know your why. Sometimes it can be discouraging, especially if we see community level or federal level or state level, things kind of roll back. So I think kind of knowing your personal why is always important to keep you going. Next, I'd encourage you to review our plan. I have some copies back there as well as QR codes. And remember, it's not just the county's plan, it's all of our plan. And then finally, I'd encourage y'all to just continue to collaborate and start conversations by understanding what can you control, where can you influence, and then where can you make your impact. So with that, feel free to contact me, or I'd love to take any questions or get in the nitty-gritty of any of the topics we talked about today. Thank you.
Is there a set of KPIs or are there a set of KPIs or metrics that you're trying to achieve within the county that you could share?
Sure. So within our plan, and I can pull it up if I can one-handed, or it's in the back. So for each, we set kind of a large goal for each focus area, but then within that, we did a sub-goal, and each sub-goal has a metric tied to it. So, for example, looking at, will it flip? So like these circles you see at the bottom of each of our focus areas, there are specific metrics tied to each of those topics. So for energy, it's like reducing our energy usage by a certain kilowatt hour. Water, it's a similar feat. Renewables, it's a certain percentage of energy usage in the county. And they're set for 5-year marks. We recognize they're not all going to happen by that 5-year, but that time frame was selected, recognizing that technology is constantly changing, legislation is changing. It gives us a good kind of stopping point to reevaluate to see, are we on pace? Is this realistic? It's just kind of that good stopping point. Sure.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. I'm happy to see that there are so many actions, both planned and underway. I'm particularly interested in learning more about the climate resilience portion. I believe the language there was adapt, withstand, and recover. But it sort of strikes me that we're missing mitigation. I feel like we shouldn't just be reacting to climate change, but actually doing our part to prevent it and reduce our emissions. So could you comment on like what we're doing there? Do we have any greenhouse gas reduction goals or like long-term carbon reduction?
Sure. So we actually chose, so rather than having climate just, or rather than having the mitigation just in climate, we kind of put those goals where the source of the issue is. So for example, you see the 5 sub-goals at the bottom of transportation. Emissions is part of transportation. We also have emissions goals as part of energy, and we also have it as part of waste, as those are the 3 main areas that we are seeing emissions come from the county. So it's kind of looped into each of these areas to address specific causes of the emissions within that sector. So for example, if we reduce our waste overall, it's going to also reduce the emissions we're seeing from waste. Or in the area of energy, if we're meeting the other sub-goals first, so if we're reducing our energy usage and switching to renewables, then by contrast, it'll also help with that mitigation. So that's how we chose to attack it, of like tying it into those other focus areas as well.
And I guess another part of my question is there a goal? Are we aiming for carbon neutral by 2050 or something like that?
There is a goal, and I don't want to misquote it, but I believe it's reducing by, I believe it's 50% over our 2019 baseline. And that's with, again, everything's within the next 5 years, recognizing that's not fully going to happen, but to also reevaluate as well. It gives us kind of that benchmark of here's long-term or short-term, stop, reevaluate. And a big part of this too is also we need to make sure, while we have a 2019 baseline for emissions, there was also some question about the practice of having that. So a lot of our baseline actions for these sections are having really strong baselines of our data. For example, in the county, like we have energy data, but it's not anywhere in a neat, organized, readable fashion. So that's another reason we kind of have this short-term goal, is it also gives us some time to get our data in order so we can actually track successfully without kind of having to do what a lot of folks do, where it's you're changing your methodology 5 years in. Hi, Howard.
I don't know if you can answer this, but what are the funding prospects for continuing these programs and moving ahead to future programs that haven't started yet?
Thank you. So, as noted, I'm paid by your tax dollars. So I think that's one kind of consistent stream that we do have. Recognizing my staff time is covered by our county taxes. In terms of specific projects, the funding is very project-based. So I'm spending a lot of time focusing on grants, as well as trying to kind of push departments within the county to implement sustainability into their projects. So for example, I was in a county council meeting recently, and I learned that some of our solar panels are being removed because they need to redo the roof on a garage. That would have been nice to know. So I went and prompted Public Works to ask, what's your plan for the panels? I learned their plan was to put them in a dumpster. Okay, that's not what we like to see. So I'll take the staff time, I'll do the legwork, that's my job. So I went down the rabbit hole of having a consultant come for free to say, hey, are these panels worth putting back on? Because they're really old, they're from 2007. Okay, we found out it would cost more to put them back on than they would be able to pay themselves off over their remaining life. Not ideal, but good to know. So then we looked, okay, is there a program for recycling panels? Because there are a lot of precious metals. Well, won't you know, the company we were paying to take them off has a recycling contractor. All we had to do was ask them. Yeah, it's a little bit more money, but in the grand scheme, it's not. So as soon as I poked, Public Works changed their contract to have recycling. So a lot of it is just having, kind of putting these ideas front of mind for county projects that are happening either way. But then for those that are kind of not within a current scope, so implementing new programs or new facilities, I'm looking for grants.
So there were trails, thought of it only in the context of recreation, when I would be happy to walk to a grocery store and all kinds of other things without taking my life in my hands. And yet, these trails are all very pretty and whatever, but they're not functional. So they're a luxury. They're a middle class kind of bourgeois thing. I have time to go hike on the trail. So just making that point. Because I have lived in places where I could walk and get groceries, and I did it several times a week, so I didn't have too heavy a load, you know. Didn't have to go somewhere else to exercise. The other thing is, I've never heard anyone talk about ride sharing here. And I'm retired, I use my car a couple times a week. Somebody else could be using my car when I'm not using it. And a county seems like, I mean, I don't want to have to, the thought of some private entrepreneur figuring this out and having to pay to share, but obviously there needs to be some infrastructure for communicating and safety and, you know, one of those kinds of things. But that, I think, would be extremely helpful. I think there are a lot of us that have vehicles we're not using all the time that would save somebody else from having to purchase one.
That is a cool idea. I don't think that's something that was in the plan, but it's certainly something to keep in mind. I think that, I know one of the things that had been brought up, and I think it's kind of worded a little wonky, but I know like having kind of ride share for multifamily units. I know that has been brought up in conversation before. It's just not something that's been worked on for implementation. I will say in terms of attacking the trails, part of your response. So second bullet down, the $2.5 million grant for neighborhood access to equity, that is kind of doing what you are bringing up. So what that project is, I'm not sure if any of you guys have driven on 291, so that's kind of the parallel to I-95. A lot of folks use it if there's accidents or just to kind of scoot through. Super dangerous road. It's about 4 lanes wide, cut right through the middle of a neighborhood. And that kind of large width encourages speeding, because if you haven't noticed, the wider the road, the kind of larger perception you have of I can go fast and be safe. So what this project is doing is they did studies to perform something called a road diet, where it cuts the road down to smaller lanes to help kind of reduce speed. And as the second part of that, what they're planning to do with the extra space is to have the East Coast Greenway Trail go along the main road. So it can be not only reducing kind of the traffic issue of safety on the roads, but also providing that more meaningful alternative for people to traverse that section as well. So it's one example. I know otherwise, if you've ever looked at the county's primary trail network document, which you can find online, if the network is built out, it is meant to be kind of those connectors that you could travel. It's just kind of a slow roll when you start to look at how many millions of dollars trails are per quarter mile.
Thank you.
Sure.
You had indicated that 97% of the streams and rivers and whatnot don't meet, I don't know if it's state standards or national standards. Can you elaborate on that? And what's the cause?
Let's look at the map. So each cause, oh, I hope it linked. So it didn't link, but I'm happy to share it if I can pull it up quickly. So the cause of the, sorry, multitasking. Give me 1 second and I'll pull up the map. Never mind, I won't pull up the map, but I'm happy to share it. It's on the county's website. If we have Wi-Fi, I can grab it. Otherwise, I'm happy to show you where to get it. But the largest cause, so it's not always like chemicals that is causing pollution in the way that we would traditionally think of it. But a lot of the time it's also excessive sedimentation, so too much dirt, for lack of a better term, in our creeks, which increases the turbidity, which is essentially like how cloudy it is. And that can impact the natural ecosystem. If you're too turbid, it increases or decreases like fish and macroinvertebrates. So I would say sedimentation seems to be like a lot of what we see in kind of our, I'll say, developing communities. But there are also things they'll call like urban contaminants. Are you able to pull up? Yeah. There you go.
Radnor Public. Yep. Connect, and it should bring you to a landing page. You just press accept.
Thank you.
Just make sure. Just accept it.
Alrighty, let's pull the map. One of the things you also see a lot of in Delaware County is we have a lot of creeks that are underground and channelized, which is also a challenge. And they're the ones that are labeled as like miscellaneous urban causes. I mean, that's fun rabbit hole to go down. I was looking at Brookhaven Borough, and they had a lot of creeks on their map that were not visible from like an overhead view. Also other fun things, electric charging stations, watershed viewer, shameless promotion of maps. Yep, this is on the county website, and I'm happy to send y'all a link, but the fast way to do it is if you go to our GIS department. So in the search bar, just type GIS, and then they have something called the Mapping Hub, and that's how you get to everything that I'm showing currently. So 648 miles of impaired streams. So up in Radnor, you can see from, if you can read the sources, red is source unknown. Blue is urban runoff and storm sewers. Purple is habitat modification. So a lot of what you're seeing in the top of your township is habitat modification. And I think if you click on these classifications, it'll go a little bit more into kind of what that means. But then if you go down the watersheds, that's where you'll often see it kind of gets away from agriculture and more into underground streams or urban runoff, which is kind of more like petrochemicals or things you're seeing just from it going over pavement. But you can also click on like the actual stream segments too. And it will tell you what it tested in that area. And all of this data is from the PADEP. So it might not be like immediately up to date, but it at least has data in the past 10 to 15 years on all of our creeks.
So if you go back to the Radnor Township, Darby Creek is red?
Yep. I think for perspective, so Dan asked if it's red in Radnor. The only area that is like the not impaired is in Ridley Creek State Park. Alrighty, so let's click here. So this says in Brown's Run, the source is unknown, but it was pathogens. So that's not super helpful in knowing. Could be, maybe algae, unsure.
We have a lot of septic systems in the township.
That could be it too. So that was a fun little side tangent, but good to know it exists.
Australia,
Mhm.
in Chester County, I heard some presentation there, and some fabulous guy who's into trying to clean up the water and study based on actually what's living in the water, its level of health. He has sort of figured out a way that communities, it could be school, community, whatever, can kind of become stewards of 1,000 feet of your waterway community, what we could consider doing, and we have this really incredible resource very close by that I'm sure would be happy to help us do that. There, apparently Pennsylvania is second only to Alaska in the miles of waterways the state has. We're obviously very poor stewards.
Yeah, and I will say, so I mean, yes. But one thing too, I think to provide context of like why we see so much pollution in our area, it's also important to recognize we're at the very, very bottom of the watershed. So we're at the very bottom of the Delaware River watershed. So essentially, all the upstream communities that feed the Delaware River have to go through Delaware County or Philadelphia before they hit the river. So we're also not in a great position where we can be perfect stewards because we're inheriting a lot. But that also doesn't mean that we're not contributing to the problem. And that doesn't mean that we're helpless in it either. I think there's a lot of things that we can do to improve. But it's kind of food for thought to recognize, like, geographically, it also kind of makes sense that we're not in as good of shape as some of the upstream counties.
You mentioned air quality is a key. Why?
Good question. So I believe a lot of it, and I don't have a nice map for that, but a lot of it's ozone, ground level ozone we have failed for in the past. I will say we've gotten better, so we're not as bad, but we're still failing. But it's a lot of pathogens as well. So you can, I would typically recommend the EPA EJ screen, but that's been taken down. But if you didn't know, Pennsylvania State also has an environmental justice screening tool, and it breaks down what kind of air quality contaminants we have. And that's more of it's called a census block level. So it goes down to like within your municipality of what the specific issues are. So I would encourage you to look at that. Sure, I can pull that up too. As you can tell, I look at these a lot, so they come up pretty easily.
Is that the search term, PAEJ?
Yep, PA Pen Enviro Screen. And this is also public. So you can go into like layers and you can click what different things are. Whoa. You can click what different things are. Obviously, I'm well adept in doing this one-handed. If I didn't turn it, this would be a lot easier to find Radnor. But, oh, here we go. So like you can click on a different census block and it'll tell you why something is rated a certain way. So you can click on pollutant burden and it'll tell you like exposure to things, population characteristics, asthma rates. So it tells you like lots of reasons why it's rated the way it is for certain pollutants. So the big thing to note here, one I would say is honestly being aware of things. Trees are always good to combating, but I would say a lot of it too is like this is a good place to put pressure on the state because they're the agency that oversees air quality permits. So they're the ones that are setting the standards, both in like regulations, but they're also the ones enforcing those regulations. As we're at kind of a local and county level, we don't have the legislative power to regulate those businesses that have to have these permits. So I'm not normally one to say like, this is where you press your government, but air quality is tricky in that we don't have as many tools in our tool belt because it's such a large encompassing issue.
Do you have a timeline for if and when we can start composting?
So I'm hoping our grant hits. Applied for $4 million. This is my third try, but we're always evolving in our application. So one of the big challenges with composting, and I apologize, it is 8 if anybody has to leave. One of the big challenges here is state permitting requirements make it very tricky to have food scraps composting. Makes it really tricky to get permitted at a large commercial level to be able to do it on a large scale. So for perspective, there's only one place in Delaware County that currently has those permits. Anybody know? Linvilla Orchards is the only place in Delaware County that has the necessary permits to do commercial food scraps processing. So if we get the grant, what we're looking to do at the county level is to have a commercial-sized composting facility at our transfer station in Chester Township. And one of the reasons for that site is there's already truck traffic, there's already space, we already own the land, and it's currently a mulching operation at that portion of the site. So it would essentially just be trying to get the permit and make it a little bit broader, so we then have a place for people to take the compost. Otherwise, right now it's a lot of recommending folks to do backyard composting or to find services like the one I mentioned earlier where the company can deal with it if you can't do it. Or like Mother Compost takes it to Linvilla. Roberta, did you have a question?
Could you talk a little bit about the Sustainable Storefront program?
So I'm not the expert, but it sounds a lot like your Eco Yards program. So media has criteria that if businesses can prove they're doing certain things, they get a sticker that goes in their front window that shows that they are going above and beyond. So that might be things like showing that they are reducing water usage or electricity usage. Maybe they're composting. Maybe they're zero packaging. It has certain criteria. I will say I'm not as in tune to what the criteria is. But Media Borough has a program, and then Newtown Township also has a sustainable business network. So they're two good examples in the area.
I have another question about the E-rating and also the rating of the streams. When we think about what that represents, does that mean harm to citizens? Does it mean irreversible, like proximity irreversible damage to the region as well?
Sure. So she asked, in greater context, what does that D air quality rating mean for us, essentially, as well as our creeks? I'm not a scientist to say if things are irreversible or not. I can tell you right now, having a D in air quality is not good for us. I will say, though, bless you, to provide greater context, it's not just Delaware County, it's our entire Philadelphia region. So even Chester County, who we always look to as kind of our open space up on a pedestal, at least I do, they also have bad air quality. So it's more of a regional issue. I think that's kind of what we inherit in being around a major city and also having a lot of industry. But it's something people do need to be aware of because it does raise our risk factors we have higher than average asthma rates. We have higher than average COPD rates in our county. So I think it's important, even just in context, to kind of recognize the risk factors and understand how that might impact you.
I assume it means also that if we're more inclined to have asthma and COPD, then we're more inclined to have accelerating health concerns, complications due to those things, as well as immune compromise, et cetera. And same with the landscape, right? If you have a polluted river, fish are struggling, you're more likely to get disease, et cetera, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think with the creeks and things in particular too, a lot of people, we use our creeks to recreate. And I think even just being aware of that, there are some people that will fish and try to eat it out of our area, where even just knowing your risk of this is probably not the area to do that, I think it's important. But even when it's letting your kids play in the creeks, letting your dogs play in the creeks, us playing in the creeks, I think a lot of it is being aware of the risks and being calculated in those things. And I think, again, it's also just considering how that can impact your health overall is important. Any other questions?
I was just going to mention, you can go to DEC hearings
permits and provide input. Sometimes it doesn't make any difference, but I think community input is always important, and they just had one last night in Marcus Hook for the, it wasn't Monroe, it was the energy transfer facility there, and renewing the permits there for that facility. And there was a lot of information of that meeting about the health impacts that might interest you.
Thank you. And I think the other thing, I'm glad you bring that up, because I think one thing too is recognizing that though Radnor is not Chester, it's issues that we all face, and it's something we should all be advocating for, even if it's not necessarily our neighbor next door. They're still our neighbors. It's still our community.
The stacks have a radius of fallout 21 miles from the stacks. And we're a lot closer than that to Chester.
Right. So, and that's why I always like to bring awareness to it, because I feel like there is kind of an attitude, and I can say I'm guilty of it too. Growing up here, I live here. I'm in Concord, but it's also like, that's a riverfront problem. That's not our problem. But it's no, this is all of our problem. We all live here, and just because we can't see it doesn't mean it's not impacting us. So,
And what stacks are you referring to? I'm sorry.
Roberta may be able to.
If you go down along the riverfront along the Delaware River, you'll see many stacks from different kinds of industries there. There's a lot of liquefied natural gas, there's Monroe Energy, there's a lot of. Okay. Oil refinery? Yeah, there used to be one oil refinery, but it's a lot of industries, because those industries built Delaware County.
So the river picture up top. Mhm.
Correct. There's also crushed steam plant and all of that. There is also, there are air monitors now, and that is getting, that air council? Clean Air Council. Yeah, and Penn is involved as well doing studies, so measuring not just particulate matter, but also volatile chemicals. And this, they're just being put up, somewhat more sophisticated, et cetera. And they're specifically asking for volunteers further away from the source to demonstrate both, well, which is it? That their levels are just as high, or that they're not as high? And so what is the burden for the people who live right by it? So I don't know the answer to that, but that's part of what they're trying to find out.
And Planning Department. So there are two grants happening. First, Clean Air Council, which I think I have to. Sorry. So Clean Air Council got a grant to do it, and they're doing a lot of community-based monitoring. So they're using purple air monitors, which anyone can buy actually, and you upload the data to a website. And then the PADEP and the county got the same grant for essentially the same focus area. So there's over 100 monitors, I think, going in between the two projects.
Yeah, I'd like to have Roberta repeat her statement about the Pennsylvania DEP hearings on petitions.
If you go to the Department of Environmental Protection, there is a website that goes through the different hearings. If you go to our EnviroDelco website, they're also posted there. So it'll give you a time and a place. And for example, the hearing last night on energy transfer is still open for comments that you can submit electronically. But it's very important to take a stand whenever you can. And also, I think it's important because the DEP also has a Citizens Advisory Council. So if you're concerned about, air quality regulations are not being upheld, or they're looking at everything as what we would call a point source of air pollution, as opposed to looking at the cumulative impact, that's a big difference. So when they look, for example, at a facility in Marcus Hook, they're looking at it as the point source and not looking at the cumulative impact of all of the facilities in the area that are impacting our air quality.
Right. Thank you.
From the League of Women Voters from Delaware County.
Sure. So for perspective on the screen, I think we've mentioned this before. I know you had just said it. The League of Women Voters made an amazing website called EnviroDelco.org. And it serves as like a clearinghouse of all things environmental. So they do a fantastic job of trying to upload any like community events, but they also do news. So the hearing Roberta mentioned, again, front page here, the environmentalists take Monroe Energy. And I know it got brought up in the EAC meeting earlier as well of if anybody knows of environmental events, you can just email them and they'll throw them on the site as well.
Yeah, it's an excellent website. They really keep it current and comprehensive with all kinds of environmental meetings and information in our area. Well, thank you so much. Thank you. Rick.